With some of the guineas left from the sale of the 10th pearl on her string, Orlando bought herself a complete outfit of such clothes as a woman then wore, and it was in the dress of a young English woman of rank that she now sat on the deck of the enamoured lady. It is a strange fact, but a true one, that up to this moment she had scarcely given her sex a thought. Perhaps the Turkish trousers which she had hitherto worn had done something to distract her thoughts, and the gipsy woman, except in one or two important particularities, differ very little from the gipsy men. At any rate, it was not until she felt the coil of skirts around her legs and the captain offered, with the greatest politeness, to have an awning spread for her on deck, that she realized with a start the penalties and privileges of her position. But that start was not the kind that might have been expected. It was not caused, that is to say, simply and solely by the thought of her chastity, and how she could preserve it. In normal circumstances, a lovely young woman alone would have thought of nothing else. The whole edifice of female government is based on the foundation stone. Chastity is their jewel, their centrepiece, which they run mad to protect, and die when ravished of. But if one has been a man for 30 years or so, and the ambassador into the bargain, if one has held a queen in one's arms and one or two other ladies, if reports be true of less exalt rank, if one has married a Rosina Pepita, and so on, one does not perhaps give such a very great start about that. Orlando's start was of a very complicated kind, and not to be summed up in a trice. Nobody, indeed, ever accused her of being one of those quick wits who run to the end of things in a minute. It took her the entire length of the voyage to moralise out the meaning of her start, and so, at her own pace, we will follow her. Lord, she thought, when she had recovered from her start, stretching herself out at length under her awning. This is a pleasant, lazy way of life, to be sure. But, she thought, giving her legs a kick, these skirts are plaguy things to have about one's heels. Yet the stuff, flowered paduasie, is the loveliest in the world. Never have I seen my own skin, here she laid her hand on her knee, look such advantage as now. Could I, however, leap overboard and swim in clothes like these? No. Therefore I should have to trust to the protection of a blue jacket. Do I object to that? Now I do, she wondered, here encountering the first knots in the smooth skein of her argument. Dinner came before she had untied it, and then it was the captain himself, Captain Nicholas Benedict Bartulus, a sea captain of distinguished aspect, who did it for her as he helped her to a slice of corned beef. A little of the fat, ma'am? He asked. Let me cut you just the tiniest little slice the size of your fingernail. At those words, a delicious tremor ran through her frame. Birds sang, the torrents rushed. It recalled the feeling of indescribable pleasure with which she had first seen Sasha hundreds of years ago. Then she had pursued. Now she fled. Which is the greater ecstasy, the man's or the woman's? And are they not perhaps the same? No, she thought, this was the most delicious, thanking the captain, but refusing. To refuse and see him frown. Well, she would, if he wished it, have the very thinnest, smallest shiver in the world. This was the most delicious of all, to yield and see him smile. For nothing, she thought, regaining her couch on deck, and continuing the argument, is more heavenly than to resist and to yield and to resist. Surely it throws the spirit into such a rapture as nothing else can. So that I'm not sure," she continued, "that I won't throw myself overboard for the mere pleasure of being rescued by a bluejacket after all." It must be remembered that she was like a child entering possession of a pleasuance or a toy cupboard. Her arguments would not condemn themselves to mature women who have had the run of it all their lives. But what use we young fellows in the cockpit of the Marie Rose to say about a woman who threw herself overboard for the pleasure of being rescued by a bluejacket, she said. We had a word for them. Ah, I have it. But we must omit that word. It was disrespectful in the extreme and passing strange on a lady's lips. Lord, Lord, she cried again at the conclusion of her thoughts, must I then begin to respect the opinion of the other sex, however monstrous I think it? If I wear skirts, if I can't swim, if I have to be rescued by a bluejacket, by God, she cried, I must, upon which a gloom fell over her. Candid by nature and averse to all kinds of unequivocation, to tell lies bored her. It seemed to her a roundabout way of going to work, yet, she reflected, the flowered patisserie, the pleasure of being rescued by a bluejacket, if these were only to be obtained by roundabout ways, roundabout one must go, she supposed. She remembered how, as a young man, she had insisted that women must be obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled. Now I shall have to pay in my own person for those desires, she reflected, for women are not, judging by my own short experience of the sex, obedient, chaste, scented, and exquisitely apparelled by nature. They can only attain these graces, without which they may enjoy none of the delights of life, by the most tedious discipline. There's the hairdressing, she thought. That alone will take an hour of my morning. There's looking in the looking-glass, another hour. There's staying and lacing. There's washing and powdering. There's changing from silk to lace, and from lace to paduasoy. There's being chaste, year in, year out. Here, she tossed her foot impatiently and shoved an inch or two of calf. A sailor on the mast who happened to look down at the moment started so violently that he missed his footing and only saved himself by the skin of his teeth. If the sight of my ankles means death to an honest fellow who, no doubt, has a wife and family to support, I must, in all humility, keep them covered, Orlando thought. Yet her legs were among her chiefest beauties. And she fell to thinking that an odd pass we have come to when all women's beauty has to be kept covered lest a sailor may fall from a masthead. A pox on them, she said, realizing for the first time what in other circumstances she would have been taught as a child, that is to say, the sacred responsibility of womanhood. And that's the last oath I shall ever be able to swear, she thought, once I set foot on English soil. And I shall never be able to crack a man over the head or tell him he lies in his teeth, or draw my sword and run him through the body, or sit among my peers, or wear a coronet, or walk in procession, or sentence a man to death, or lead an army, or prance down Whitehall on a charger, or wear 72 different medals on my breast. All I can do once I set foot on English soil is to pour out tea and ask my lords how they like it. Do you take sugar? Do you take cream? And mincing out the words, she was horrified to perceive how low an opinion she was forming of the other sex, the manly, to which it had once been her pride to belong. To fall from a masthead, she thought, because you see a woman's ankles, to dress up like Guy Fawkes and parade the streets, so that women may praise you, to deny a woman teaching lest she may laugh at you, to be the slave of the frailest chit in petticoats, and yet to go about as if you were the lords of creation. Heavens, she thought, what fools they make of us, what fools we are. And here, it would seem, from some ambiguity in her terms that she was censoring both sexes equally, as if she belonged to neither, and indeed, for the time being, she seemed to vacillate. She was man, she was woman, she knew the secrets, shared the weaknesses of each. It was a most bewildering and whirligig state of mind to be in. The comforts of ignorance seemed utterly denied her. She was a feather blown on the gale. Thus it is no great wonder as she pitted one sex against the other, and found each alternatively full of the most deplorable infirmities, and was not sure to which she belonged. It was no great wonder that she was about to cry out that she would return to Turkey and become a gypsy again, when the anchor fell with a great splash into the sea. The sails came tumbling on deck, and she perceived, so sunk had she been in thought that she had seen nothing for several days, that the ship was anchored off the coast of Italy. The captain at once sent to ask the honour of her company ashore with him in the longboat. When she returned the next morning, she stretched herself on her couch under the awning, and arranged her draperies with the greatest decorum about her ankles. Ignorant and poor as we are compared with the other sex, she thought, continuing the sentence which she had left unfinished the other day, armoured with every weapon as they are, while they debar us even from a knowledge of the alphabet. And from these opening words it is plain that something had happened during the night to give her a push towards the female sex, for she was speaking more as a woman speaks rather than a man, yet with a sort of content after all. Still, they fall from the masthead. Here she gave a great yawn and fell asleep. When she woke, the ship was sailing before a fair breeze, so near the shore that towns on the cliff's edge seemed only kept from slipping into the water by the interposition of some great rock or the twisted roots of some ancient olive tree. The scent of oranges wafted from a million trees, heavy with fruits, reached her on deck. A score of blue dolphins, twisting their tails, leapt high now and again into the air, stretching her arms out. Arms, she had learnt already, have no such fatal effects as legs. She thanked heaven that she was not prancing down Whitehall on a war-horse, nor even sentencing a man to death. Better is it, she thought, to be clothed with poverty and ignorance, which are the dark garments of the female sex. Better to leave the rule and discipline of the world to others, better to quit of material ambition, the love of power, and all the other manly desires, if so one can more fully enjoy the most exalted raptures known to the human spirit, which are, she said aloud, as her habit was when deeply moved, contemplation, solitude, love. Praise God that I'm a woman, she said, and was about to run into the extreme folly, than which none is more distressing in woman or man either, of being proud of her sex, when she paused over the singular word which, for all we can do is put it in its place, has crept in at the other end of the last sentence. Love. Love, says Orlando, instantly. Such is its impetuosity. Love took a human shape. Love is its pride. For where other thoughts are content to remain abstract, nothing will satisfy this one but to put on flesh and blood, mantilla and petticoats, hose and jerkins. And, as Orlando's loves had been women now, through the culpable laggardry of the human frame to adopt itself in convention, though she herself was a woman, it was still a woman she loved, and if the consciousness of being of the same sex had any effect at all, it was to quicken and deepen those feelings which she had had as a man. For now 1,000 hints and mysteries came plain to her that were then dark. Now the obscurities which divides the sexes and lets linger innumerable impurities in its gloom was removed, and if there is anything in what the poet says about truth and beauty, this affection gained in beauty what is lost in falsity. At last she cried. She knew Sasha as she was, and in the ardour of this discovery and in the pursuit of all those treasures which were now revealed, she was so rapt and enchanted that it was as if a cannonball had exploded at her ear when a man's voice said, "Permit me, madam." A man's hand raised her to her feet, and her fingers of a man with a three-masted sailing ship tattooed on the middle finger pointed to the horizon. "The cliffs of England, ma'am," said the captain, and he raised the hand which had pointed at the sky to the salute. Orlando now gave a second start, even more violent than the first. "Jesus Christ," she cried. Happily, the sight of her native land after long absence excused both start and exclamation, or she would have been hard put to it to explain to Captain Bartolus the raging and conflicting emotions which now boiled within her. How tell him that she, who now trembled on his arm, had been a duke and an ambassador? How explain to him that she, who had been lapped like a lily in folds of paduacy, had hacked heads off and lain with loose women among treasure sacks in the holds of pirate ships on summer nights when the tulips were abloom and the bees buzzing off wapping old stars? Not even to herself could she explain the giant start she gave, as the resolute right hand of the sea captain indicated the cliffs of the British Islands. "To refuse and to yield," she murmured. "How delightful! To pursue and conquer. How august to perceive and to reason. How sublime!" Not one of these words so coupled together seemed to her wrong. Nevertheless, as the chalky cliffs loomed nearer, she felt culpable, dishonoured, unchaste, which, for one who had never given the matter a thought, was strange. Closer and closer they drew, till the samphire gatherers, hanging halfway down the cliff, were plain to the naked eye, and watching them she felt scampering up and down within her like some derisive ghost who in another instant will pick up her skirt and flaunt out of sight. Sasha the lost, Sasha the memory, whose reality she had proved just now so surprisingly. Sasha, she felt, mocking and mowing, and making all sorts of disrespectful gestures towards the cliffs and the samphire gatherers. And when the sailors began chanting, "So goodbye and adieu to you, ladies of Spain," the words echoed on Orlando's sad heart, and she felt that however much landing there meant comfort, meant opulence, meant consequence and state, for she would doubtless pick up some notable prince and reign, his consort over half Yorkshire. Still, if it meant conventionality, meant slavery, meant deceit, meant dyeing her love, fettering her limbs, pursuing her lips, and restraining her tongue, then she would turn about with the ship and set sail once more for the gypsies. Among the hurry of these thoughts, however, there now rose, like a dome of smooth white marble, something which, whether fact or fancy, was so impressive to her fevered imagination that she settled upon it as one has seen a swarm of vibrant dragonflies alight, with apparent satisfaction, upon the glass bell which shelters some tender vegetable. The form of it, by the hazard of fancy, recalled that earliest, most persistent memory, the man with the big forehead in Twitchett's sitting-room, the man who sat writing, or rather looking, but certainly not at her, for he never seemed to see her poised there in all her finery. Lovely boy though she must have been, she could not deny it, and whenever she thought of him, the thought spread round it, like the risen moon on turbulent waters, a sheet of silver calm. Now her hand went to her bosom, the other was still in the captain's keeping, where the pages of her poem were hidden safely. It might have been a talisman that she kept there. The distraction of sex, which hers was, and what it meant, subsided. She thought now only of the glory of poetry, and the great lines of Marlowe, Shakespeare, Ben Jonson, Milton began booming and reverberating, as if a golden clapper beat against the golden bell in the cathedral tower which was her mind. The truth was that the image of the marble dome, which her eyes had first discovered so faintly that it suggested a poet's forehand and thus started a flock of irrelevant ideas, was no figment, but a reality, and as the ship advanced down the Thames before a favouring gale, the image, with all its associations, gave place to the truth and revealed itself as nothing more and nothing less than the dome of a vast cathedral rising amongst a fretwork of white spires. "St. Paul's," said the Captain Barbarous, Bartulus, who stood by her side. "The Tower of London," he continued. "Greenwich Hospital, erected in memory of Queen Mary by her husband, his late Majesty William III. Westminster Abbey. The Houses of Parliament." As he spoke, each of these famous buildings rose to view. It was a fine September morning. A myriad of little watercraft piled from bank to bank. Rarely has a gayer or more interesting spectacle presented itself into the gaze of a returned traveller. Orlando hung over the prow, absorbed in wonder. Her eyes had been used too long to savages and nature not to be entranced by these urban glories. That, then, was the dome of St. Paul's, which Mr. Wren had built during her absence. Near by, a shock of golden hair burst from a pillar. Captain Bartulus was at her side to inform her that was the monument. There had been a plague and a fire during her absence, he said. Do what she could to restrain them. The tears came to her eyes until, remembering that it is becoming of a woman to weep, she let them flow. Here, she thought, had been the great carnival. Here, where the waves slapped briskly, had stood the royal pavilion. Here she had first met Sasha. About here she looked down into the sparkling waters. One had been used to see the frozen bumboat woman with her apples on her lap. All that splendour and corruption was gone. Gone too was the dark night, the monstrous downpour, the violent surges of the flood. Here, where yellow icebergs had raced circling with a crew of terror-stricken wretches on top, a convoy of swans floated, orgulous, undulant, superb. London itself had completely changed since she had last seen it. Then she remembered it had been a huddle of little black beetle-browed houses. The heads of rebels had grinned on pikes at Temple Bar. The cobbled pavements had reeked of garbage and ordure. Now, as the ship sailed past Wapping, she caught glimpses of broad and orderly thoroughfares. Stately coaches drawn by teams of well-fed horses stood at the doors of houses whose bow windows, whose plate glass, whose polished knockers testified to the wealth and modesty, dignity of the dwellers inside. Ladies in flowered silk, she put the captain's glass to her eye, walked on raised footpath. Citizens in broidered coats took snuff at street corners under lamp-posts. She caught sight of a variety of painting signs swinging in the breeze, and could form a rapid notion from what was painted on them of the tobacco, of the stuff, of the silk, of the gold, of the silverware, of the gloves, of the perfumes, and of 1,000 other articles which were sold within. Nor could she do more as the ship sailed to its anchorage by London Bridge than glance at coffee-house windows where, on balconies, since the weather was fine, a great number of decent citizens sat at ease, with china dishes in front of them, clay pipes at their sides, while one among them read from a news sheet, and was frequently interrupted by the laughter of the comments of the others. Were these taverns? Were these wits? Were these poets? She asked of Captain Bartulus, who obligingly informed her that even now, if she turned her head a little to the left and looked along the line of his first finger, so they were passing the cocoa-tree, where, yes, there he was. One might see Mr. Addison taking his coffee. The other two gentlemen, there, ma'am, a little to the right of the lamp-post. One of them humped the other, much the same as you or me, were Mr. Dryden and Mr. Pope. Sad dogs, said the captain, by which he meant that they were papists, but men of parts none the less, he added, hurrying aft to superintend the arrangements for landing. Addison, Dryden, Pope, Orlando repeated as if the words were an incarnation. For one moment she saw the high mountains of Barbarossa. The next she set her foot upon her native shore. But now Orlando was to learn how little the most tempestuous flutters of excitement avails against the iron countenance of the law, how harder than the stones of London Bridge it is, and than the lips of a cannon more severe. No sooner had she returned to her home in Blackfriars than she was made aware by a succession of Bow Street runners and other grave emissaries from the law courts that she was a party to three major suits which had been preferred against her during her absence, as well as innumerable minor litigations, some arising out of, others depending on them. The chief charges against her were: 1. That she was dead and therefore could not hold any property whatsoever. 2. That she was a woman, which amounts to much the same thing. 3. That she was an English duke who had married one Rosina Pepita, a dancer, and had had by her 3 sons, which sons, now declaring that their father was deceased, claimed that all his property descended to them. Such grave charges as these would, of course, take time and money to dispose of. All her estates were put in chancery, and her titles pronounced in abeyance, while the suits were under legislation. Thus it was in a highly ambiguous condition, uncertain whether she was alive or dead, man or woman, duke or nunnery, that she posted down to her country seat, where, pending the legal judgment, she had the law's permission to reside in a state of incognito or incognita, as the case might turn out to be. It was a fine evening in December when she arrived, and the snow was falling, and her violet shadows were slanting much as she had seen them from the hilltop in Brucia. The great house lay more like a town than a house, brown and blue, rose and purple in the snow, with all its chimneys smoking busily as if inspired with a life of their own. She could not restrain a cry as she saw it there, tranquil and massive, couched upon the meadows. As the yellow coach entered the park and came bowling along the drive between the trees, the red deer raised their heads as if expectantly, and it was observed that instead of showing the timidity nature to their kind, they followed the coach and stood about the courtyard when it drew up. Some tossed their antlers, others pawed the ground as the step was let down to Orlando alighted. One, it is said, actually knelt in the snow before her. She had not time to reach her hand towards the knocker before both wings of the great doors were flung open, and there the lights and torches held above their hands were Mrs. Grimditch, Mr. Dupper, and a whole retinue of servants come to greet her. But the orderly procession was interrupted first by the impetuosity of Canute, the elk-hound, who threw himself with such an ardour upon his mistress that he almost knocked her to the ground. Next, by the agitation of Mrs. Grimditch, who, making as if to curtsy, was overcome with emotion and could do no more than grasp "Milord, milady, milady, milord," until Orlando comforted her with a hearty kiss upon both cheeks. After that, Mr. Dupper began to read from a parchment, but the dogs barking, the huntsmen winding their horns, and the stags who had come into the courtyard in confusion, baying the moon, not much progress was made, and the company dispersed within after crowding about their mistress and testifying in every way to their great joy at her return. No one showed an instant suspicion that Orlando was not the Orlando they had known. If any doubt there was in the human mind, the action of the deer and the dogs would have been enough to dispel it, for the dumb creatures, as it is well known, are far better judges both of identity and character than we are. Moreover, said Mrs. Grimditch, over her dish of China tea to Mr. Dupper that night, if her lord was a lady now, she had never seen a lovelier one, nor was there a penny piece to choose between them. One was as well favoured as the other. They were as alike as two peaches in one branch, which, said Mrs. Grimditch, was becoming confidential. She had always had her suspicions. Here she nodded her head very mysteriously, it was no surprise to her. Here she nodded her head very knowingly, and for her part a very great comfort, for with the towels wanting mending and the curtains in the chaplain's parlour being moth eaten around the fringes, it was time they had a mistress among them, and some little masters and mistresses to come after her. Mr. Dupper added, being privileged by virtue of his holy office to speak his mind on such delicate matters as these. So while the old servants gossiped in their servants' hall, Lando took a silver candle in her hand, and roamed once more through the halls, the gallantries, the courts, the bedrooms, saw loom down at her again the dark visage of the Lord Keeper. That Lord Chamberlain among her ancestors sat now in this chair of state, now reclined on the canopy of delight, observed the arras, how it swayed, watching the huntsman riding and Daphne flying, bathed her hands as she loved to do as a child in the yellow pool of light which the moonlight had falling through the heraldic leopard in the window, slid along the polished planks of the gallery, the other side of which was rough timber, touched this silk, that satin, fancied the carved dolphins swam, brushed her hair with King James's silver brush, buried her face in the pot-pourri which was made as the Conqueror had taught them many 100 years ago, and from the same roses, looked at the garden and imagined the sleeping crocuses and dormant Delilahs, saw the frail nymphs gleaming white in the snow, and the great yew hedges thick as a house, black behind them, saw an orangeries and giant medlars. All this she saw, and each sight and sound, rudely as we write it down, filled her heart with such a lust and balm of joy, that at length, tired out, she entered the chapel and sank into the old red armchair in which her ancestors used to hear service. There she lit a cheroot. 'Twas a habit she had brought back from the East, and opened the prayer book. It was a little book bound in velvet, stitched with gold, which had been held by Mary Queen of Scots on the scaffold, and the eye of faith could detect a brownish stain said to be made of a drop of the royal blood. But what pious thoughts it roused in Orlando, what evil passions it soothed asleep, who dare say, seeing that of all communications with the deity is most inscrutable. Novelist, poet, historian, all falter with their hands on that door, nor does the believer himself enlighten us, for is he more ready to die than other people, or more eager to share his goods? Does he not keep as many maids and carriage horses as the rest, and yet with it all holds a faith, he says, which should make goods a vanity and death desirable? In the Queen's prayer book, along with the blood stain, was also a lock of hair and a crumb of pastry. Orlando now added to these keepsakes a flake of tobacco, and so, reading and smoking, was moved by the humane jumble of them all, the hair, the pastry, the blood-stained tobacco, such a mood of contemplation as gave her a reverent air suitable in the circumstances, though she had, it is said, no traffic with the usual god. Nothing, however, can be more arrogant, though nothing is more commoner, than to assume that of gods there is only one, and of religions none but the speakers. Orlando, it seemed, had faith of her own. With all the religious ardour in the world, she now reflected upon her sins and the imperfections that had crept into her spiritual state. The letter S, she reflected, is the serpents in the poet's Eden. Do what she would, there were still too many of these sinful reptiles in the first stanzas of the oak tree. But S was nothing, in her opinion, compared with the termination of ing. The present participle is the devil himself. She thought, now that we are in the place for believing in devils, to evade such temptations is the first duty of the poet, she concluded, for as the ear is the antechamber to the soul, poetry can adulterate, and destroy more surer than lust or gunpowder. Adulterate. The poet's, then, is the highest office of all, she continued. His words reach where others fall short. A silly song of Shakespeare has done more for the poor and the wicked than all the preachers and philanthropists in the world. No time nor devotion can be too great, therefore, which makes the vehicle of our message less distorting. We must shape our words till they are the thinnest integument of our thoughts. Thoughts are divine, etc. Thus it is obvious that she was back in the confines of her own religion, which time had only strengthened in her absence, and was rapidly acquiring the intolerance of belief.